911, what is your emergency?
There's an alligator. It's got my husband. Please, you have to help us.
I need your location immediately.
Please stay on the line.
I don't have a phone. I had to go to a neighbor's house. It's Timothy, my husband. It took his arm.
Hurricane Ida was a monster, a Category 4 beast that tore through Louisiana with a savage ferocity. It brought with it winds that could rip the roofs off houses and a storm surge that swallowed entire communities. But for one family in Slidell, the real monster wasn't the wind or the water. It was something far more ancient, far more primal, lurking just below the surface. A creature that had lived in these swamps for millions of years. An apex predator that had, for generations, coexisted with man. But that day, that fragile peace was shattered. This is a story about a storm, yes, but it's more than that. It's a story about a man, his home, and the terrifying moment when the world as he knew it was swept away, leaving him face to face with a nightmare he never thought possible. A story that reminds us that no matter how much we control our world, nature always holds the final terrifying card. What would you do if the one you loved was taken by something you couldn't fight? Something that wasn't just a threat, but a force of nature itself? What would you give to have just one more moment? And what do you do when all you're left with is the sound of a scream and a silence that echoes for a lifetime? Timothy Satterlee Sr, a man who had seen 71 years of sunrises and sunsets, was a pillar of his community in Slidell. Not just a neighbor, but a friend, a man with a kind face and a booming laugh that could fill a room. He and his wife Dianne had built a life together, a quiet, simple life filled with the rhythms of the Bayou. They knew the land, they knew the water, and they had a deep respect for the wild world around them. Timothy wasn't a thrill seeker. He was a family man. He loved his children, his grandchildren, and his wife with a quiet, unwavering devotion. He was the kind of man who would lend you his last tool and never ask for it back. His passion was his workshop, a small, cluttered shed out back that was his sanctuary. It was where he fixed things, built things, and escaped from the world. It smelled of sawdust and old motor oil, a comforting, familiar scent that was as much a part of him as his easygoing nature. He spent countless hours in that shed, meticulously working on projects, his hands calloused from a lifetime of labor. He was a craftsman, a fixer, and a problem solver. He was a man who believed in hard work and taking care of what you had. The Satterlees had lived in this area for decades. They'd seen storms come and go, some bad, some worse. They had their routine down to a science. They knew what to board up, what to bring inside, and how to hunker down until the worst had passed. They knew the floodwaters would rise, but they also knew they would recede. This was their home, and they were ready for whatever Ida could throw at them. They were veterans of the Bayou, and they weren't about to let a hurricane scare them away from the life they had built. But even a seasoned veteran can be caught off guard. Even a man who thought he knew the land better than anyone can be blindsided by a threat he never saw coming. The storm was the main event, the headline news. But the real story, the one that would haunt this community forever, was unfolding in the quiet, treacherous waters that Ida left in her wake. This wasn't a fight against wind and rain. It was a battle against something far more ancient, something that had been watching from the shadows long before the storm ever arrived. The American alligator, Alligator mississippiensis, is a symbol of the South. A living relic of a prehistoric era, they are the undisputed kings of the swamp. They can grow to massive sizes, with males often exceeding 12 feet in length and weighing over 500 pounds. This one, the one that would forever change the Satterlee family's life, was a true titan. A 12-foot, 504-pound beast that had likely been patrolling these waters for decades, silently observing the world from its murky domain. These animals are ambush predators. They are not built for a chase. Instead, they wait, their eyes and nostrils just barely breaking the surface of the water, a submerged log with a terrifying secret. They are creatures of opportunity, of instinct. Their bite force is immense, one of the strongest in the animal kingdom, capable of crushing bone with terrifying ease. Once they latch on, They perform what is known as a death roll, a violent, disorienting spin that tears flesh and dismembers their prey. It's an ancient, effective, and brutal hunting technique. Fatal alligator attacks on humans are, statistically, incredibly rare. They are shy creatures by nature, and they generally fear people. They prefer to avoid confrontation. Warnings about alligators are common in Louisiana. Don't feed them. Don't swim in their territory, and always be aware of your surroundings. But these warnings are often seen as boilerplate, common sense advice. They are the background noise of life in the bayou, not a direct threat. People live with alligators. They coexist. The fear is there, a distant hum, but it's not a daily present terror. The idea that a gator would intentionally target a human, especially in their own backyard, seemed unthinkable. But Hurricane Ida changed the rules. The storm surge didn't just flood the streets, it connected the wetlands to the residential areas, blurring the lines between human and animal territory. It created a chaotic, disorienting new world where the ancient rules no longer applied. It washed away the natural boundaries, and in doing so, it brought a hunter and its unsuspecting prey into a horrifying, direct collision course. The storm didn't just bring the water, it brought the predator right to the front door. Before the day of the attack, there were no documented incidents of this specific alligator causing trouble. It was a phantom, a silent resident of the swamp. But in the days leading up to the storm, there was a feeling of unease, a growing tension in the air, a sense that something was wrong. The wildlife seemed different, more skittish, or perhaps more brazen. The storm itself was the ultimate warning, a colossal red flag waving in the face of the community. The floodwaters, a mixture of storm surge and rainfall, rose with a sinister swiftness. They transformed the familiar landscape into a murky, treacherous soup. What was once solid ground became an extension of the swamp. The lines between what was a yard and what was a bayou were completely gone. For creatures like the alligator, this was not a disaster. It was an opportunity, a new hunting ground, a new world to explore, free from the old predictable barriers. For Timothy and Dianne, the focus was on survival, on protecting their home and their lives from the storm itself. The alligator was the furthest thing from their minds. The warnings about wildlife were distant, theoretical. They had dealt with the occasional snake or raccoon, but a large alligator? Not in their yard, not in their shed. But the water was an invitation. It was a bridge built of liquid chaos, leading from the alligator's natural habitat right to the Satterlees' doorstep. The initial incidents weren't violent, not yet. They were subtle, a rustle in the bushes that shouldn't have been there, a ripple in the floodwater that seemed too large. These were things that went unnoticed, or were dismissed as a result of the chaos of the storm. The Satterlees were focused on the bigger picture, on the wind tearing at the roof and the water creeping up the steps. They couldn't see the silent, cold-blooded hunter that was slowly, patiently making its way closer, drawn by the new expanded territory and the potential for a meal. The stage was set, not just by the hurricane, but by a series of ignored, almost invisible signs that something ancient and terrible was on the move. The day started like any other during the storm, a blur of wind and rain. The Satterlees had hunkered down, waiting for the worst to pass. The water was everywhere. It lapped at their front porch, a constant menacing presence. Timothy, ever the fixer, had to go to his shed. The specific reason is lost to the chaos of that day, but it was likely something crucial. A generator, a tool, something they needed to get through the storm. He waded through the chest-high water, a familiar journey that had become a terrifying ordeal. He made it to the shed, and for a few moments, there was a sense of normalcy. The clatter of tools, the familiar sense. But then, Dianne heard it. Not the wind, not the rain, but a sudden, violent commotion. A splash that was too loud, too heavy to be a branch falling. A cry that was not a scream of fear, but a scream of pure, visceral pain. She rushed to the doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. The sight that greeted her was something out of a horror movie. Her husband was in the water. A massive, dark shape latched onto his arm. The alligator was in a frenzied death roll, spinning its enormous body with a brutal, sickening efficiency. Timothy's face was a mask of shock and agony, his body thrashing in a desperate, futile attempt to break free. The water around them was a roiling mess of mud and blood. The sounds were a horrifying symphony of a man's pleas and an animal's guttural rage. Dianne, fueled by a primal instinct, didn't hesitate. She grabbed whatever she could and started pulling. The strength of the alligator was immense, but she fought with a desperate, superhuman fury. She was able to pull Timothy, or what was left of him, to the relative safety of the porch steps. The alligator, its job done, released its hold and submerged, disappearing back into the murky water as if it had never been there. Timothy's arm was gone. The gaping, bloody wound was a testament to the sheer power of the beast. He was alive, but barely. He was conscious, in unimaginable pain, and bleeding profusely. Dianne, in a state of utter shock and panic, knew they needed help. But the storm had knocked out their phone service. There was no way to call 911. Her only option was to go for help herself. She grabbed a small boat, a John boat, and against all reason and safety, she pushed off into the raging floodwaters. The journey to a neighbor's house was a terrifying blur of wind, rain, and the constant fear that the alligator was still out there, watching, waiting. She had to leave him, but what choice did she have? When she finally made it to a neighbor's and the call was made, the seconds felt like hours. The minutes felt like an eternity. She returned with the deputies, her heart full of a desperate, fleeting hope that he would still be there, that he would be safe. But he was gone. The steps were empty, save for the dark crimson stain on the wood. The water had taken him, and with him, any hope they had of a rescue. The silent hunter had returned, and this time it had finished its work. The call came in, frantic and disjointed. A woman, a small boat, a terrifying story of an alligator attack. Officers from the St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office were dispatched, but the conditions were horrendous. The roads were impassable, the floodwaters were high, and the wind was still howling. They had to navigate a world that had been completely transformed by the storm. It was a race against time in an environment that seemed designed to thwart them at every turn. When they finally arrived at the Satterlee home, the scene was one of unimaginable devastation. The quiet suburban street was a river. The house, normally a beacon of warmth, was silent and eerie. The dark stain on the porch steps was a grim testament to the struggle that had taken place. There was no sign of Timothy. A frantic, desperate search was launched immediately. St. Tammany. Parish Sheriff Randy Smith, a man with a steady demeanor and a lifetime of experience, knew this was a different kind of tragedy. The search involved not just his deputies, but a massive coordinated effort from state and federal agencies. They brought in boats, divers, and every resource they had. They scoured the floodwaters, the nearby bayous, and the acres of swamp that had been expanded by the storm. They were looking for a needle in a watery haystack, a man who had been taken by a predator. Witness accounts were limited and heartbreaking. Dianne's testimony was the only real lead they had. Her description of the attack was chilling and detailed. She recounted the death roll, the loss of his arm, the desperate struggle. The neighbors who helped her were in shock, their minds unable to process the horror of her story. They could only confirm the frantic woman in the small boat and the desperate phone call. The community was reeling, not just from the hurricane, but from the realization that a silent, ancient predator had been living among them, and it had claimed one of their own. The search continued for 2 agonizing weeks, a testament to the community's refusal to give up hope, even when all hope seemed lost. The search, a grueling 2-week ordeal, finally came to an end on September 13, 2021. The St. Tammany Parish Sheriff's Office, in conjunction with wildlife and fisheries officials, had been setting traps in the area where the attack occurred. One of those traps finally snagged a suspect, a colossal alligator, a true leviathan. It was 12 feet long and weighed a staggering 504 pounds. It was the largest gator they had ever seen in that area. The decision was made to euthanize the animal, a grim but necessary step to confirm their suspicions and to ensure the community was safe. The animal was taken to a secure location for an autopsy. The subsequent findings were a devastating confirmation of their worst fears. Inside the alligator's stomach, they found human remains. The St. Tammany Parish Coroner's Office faced a difficult task. The remains were, understandably, in a state that made visual identification impossible. They turned to advanced DNA technology. They took samples from the remains and compared them to DNA provided by Timothy Satterlee Sr.'s children. The results were conclusive. The coroner's office was able to achieve an 11-point DNA match, a level of certainty that was more than sufficient to make a legal identification. The remains belonged to Timothy. The news was a somber, heartbreaking end to a terrifying mystery. The story exploded in the media. It was a national sensation. Local news channels were flooded with reports, and it quickly became a headline across the country. The rarity of the event was a major part of the story. For decades, the public perception was that fatal alligator attacks were a thing of the past, a relic of a wilder time. This incident shattered that perception. The community of Slidell was left to grapple not just with the loss of a beloved neighbor, but with a new deep-seated fear. The Bayou, once a source of life and beauty, now held a terrifying new meaning. A memorial was held for Timothy, a man who had faced a hurricane and lost to a far more ancient, silent enemy. The legal consequences were straightforward. There were none. An alligator is a wild animal. The tragedy was an act of nature, a horrifying collision of man and beast, and a stark reminder that even in our modern world, we are not always at the top of the food chain. The story of Timothy Satterlee Sr. is a somber and powerful one. It serves as a stark reminder that for all of our technology, for all of our advancements, and for all of the progress we make in controlling our world, nature is a force that can never be truly tamed. We can build levees and storm walls. We can predict hurricanes with incredible accuracy, but we cannot predict the ancient primal instincts of the creatures that live alongside us. The floodwaters of Hurricane Ida didn't just destroy homes. They erased the boundaries between our world and theirs. They brought a silent, prehistoric hunter to a suburban doorstep, and in doing so, they took a kind man who was simply trying to weather the storm. His death was a tragic anomaly, a statistical improbability. But for those who knew him, for his wife who fought so desperately to save him, it was a profound, life-altering truth. The Bayou whispers secrets, and sometimes those secrets have teeth. And in the silent aftermath of the storm, the community of Slidell was left with the chilling knowledge that the monster wasn't a metaphor. It was real, it was out there, and it was waiting for the next flood.